Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Captain Fi, the Financial Independence Podcast. G'day! Welcome to an episode of Captain Fi, the Financial Independence Podcast, where I open the cockpit to some of the best and brightest in personal finance, as well as those who've reached or are on their way to financial independence. Before we get started today, remember anything on the show is provided for general information only and should not be taken as constituting professional advice. You should always do your own research when making any financial decision. On board today, we have Amy Lunardi, an experienced property investor and buyer's advocate. Amy is barely into her 30s and has already built up an impressive property portfolio, which she continues to grow. Initially working in the public sector, Amy devoted her evenings and weekends to researching, buying, renovating, and even developing properties. In doing so, she found her true passion and took a leap of faith, leaving her comfortable government job and pursuing her dreams to start her very own property business. With over 6 years of economics and commerce study and 10 years of practical property experience behind her, she now heads her own successful property advocacy firm. She provides buyer's agent and vendor advocacy services to help people make smarter property investment choices. Amy is passionate about financial education and even runs her own blog and podcast, all centered around helping first-time investors into the market. Today, we explore more of Australia's obsession with property, some of the mistakes and misconceptions I personally have, some of the benefits and risks of property investing, and how a property advocate might be able to help you make smarter property investment decisions. We, of course, also discuss Amy's personal property investing strategies and explore just how she is using property to become financially independent. First up, Amy, thank you so much for making time.
Great to be here, Captain.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with property?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Amy Lunardi and I'm a property advocate. So what that means is I'm a buyer's agent. I help people buy property, but I also do vendors advocacy, which means I help people sell property, choose an agent, and run through that whole campaign. I'm also a property investor myself and a qualified property investment advisor. And I've done renovations and property development. So fair to say, lots of property-based stuff. And I got into property, I actually studied economics. So I originally started working in state government, which was totally the opposite to the property industry. And I felt like I should be doing that because that's what I'd studied. That's what I'd spent 6 years doing. My commerce degree. So I got a job in the economics department of state government and just found that very slow, it just wasn't aligned with my interests. So always been passionate about property. I decided to do a total career shift, started right at the very bottom in property leasing. So minimum wage, just a foot in the door, and then just worked my way up since then. That was nearly 10 years ago now.
You sound incredibly qualified, by the way.
The thing about the property industry is that you don't actually need any type of qualifications to be in the industry or to give property investment advice, which is quite horrifying. It's not regulated at all. Yep. So yes, I do have all of these qualifications and experience, but you don't have to finish year 12 to give property investment advice. That's why the industry has a lot of spruikers and has a lot of people who get caught up with bad advice because there's no minimum standard and the government does not regulate it.
That's really interesting. I dare say if I looked at my social media feed, the majority of those ads would be for property investments.
Yeah, 100%. It's quite horrifying.
Why the shift then away from commerce in government into starting your own business?
Well, I just always had this pull towards property, but I had no idea at the time what buyer's advocacy was. I didn't know that that was a thing. So I started in property leasing, knowing that was just an entry level position. And then actually started my master's in property to see if I was interested in commercial property, which I wasn't. And then was just really fortunate to get an entry level position into buyer's advocacy, which has just been life changing for me. It's something I absolutely love doing because unlike selling property, it's purely advice. So I'm not selling a particular product. I'm helping a client achieve a goal through finding a property that fits their brief, fits their goals and values.
I've had a number of colleagues and friends to get started in investing in property have used a buyer's agent. And I'm trying to think back when I did an interview with Simon and Emily, which was a couple that have a blog called Smash Davo, which is similar to yours.
Yeah.
They, I think they said they got started with a buyer's advocate as well, and once they basically felt more comfortable with property investing, they've then relied less on the advocate and more on their own knowledge and experience. But I can see how useful a buyer's advocate would be for someone who, you know, is quite frankly probably a little terrified of
Yeah.
in making such a huge investment when they don't actually know anything about property.
Yeah, and I do think that anyone buying a property, whether it's a home or an investment, should consider hiring a professional because, it is a massive decision, but also you've got that real estate agent who is acting on behalf of the vendor. So it does make sense to have someone on your side. That being said, as a home buyer, it's obviously a lot more personal. As an investor, I think that you absolutely need to consider hiring a professional because there's so much to it. There's so much more that people don't realize to property investment.
I'm in the process of building everything that I thought was going to be easy and straightforward. Wasn't. I've never filled out so many forms in my life. We didn't go through a buyer's agent, but we do have a a project manager and
Yes.
a mortgage broker who are helping in that process. But yeah, the only reason I did that is because I teamed up with a close friend who's done a lot of these before, and that was the only way that I felt comfortable to actually do it. I was actually previously looking at getting a buyer's agent for an investment property. So yeah, it's definitely
Well, you've thrown yourself in the deep end for sure, starting with doing a development. That is absolutely something that quite a few investors would consider later down the track, or perhaps if they have some experience doing it or if they're in the industry. But to do it as your first project, that is a big undertaking.
like I said, I guess I feel lucky and that I trust my partner in the development, but it's certainly something I would not have attempted on my own. And prior to that opportunity presenting itself, I was actually just looking for something like a 4 bedroom established house that I could literally just put on for rent that a family might move into. Speaking of actually getting an agent, what is the process that someone would actually find a buyer's agent, and how much do they need to pay? Like, is it an hourly rate or?
Yeah, so every buyer's agent is going to have a very different model. There are percentage based models where some advocates will charge a certain percent of the purchase price. But then I do a fixed fee. So whether it's a $400,000 property or 4 million, it's the same fee. For me, it is um, a similar amount of work, and it's also good for someone to know exactly how much they are paying at the start. I also think that considering I'm on the buying side, I shouldn't be incentivized for my client to be paying more for a property. So, and every buyer's agent will have a different, I guess, specialty. So some buyer's agents might only work in certain locations. Some of them might only work with certain types of clients, for example, just investors or just home buyers. So it really is about shopping around and talking to a lot of BAs and just seeing what they specialize in and then finding one that might work for your budget. It's such a broad range in terms of costs.
So here's the $60,000 question. What does a BA set you back? Is there like an industry standard? How does one know they're getting a good deal?
Oh, I would look at it more around, what is their experience and what value are they going to add. There's really no industry standard. It totally ranges. So it'd be misleading if I tried to give an average, I reckon. So my fee ranges depending on the level of service that the client's looking for. So I have three packages, and I really sit down with them at the start and I tell the client which package I think would suit them best.
This is not financial advice. We're just two people chatting about property.
Correct.
What might be some of the reasons you might get into property?
So property, when you're looking at property as an asset, there's two ways that you can get a return. One is your capital growth, and one is through your rental income. And the great thing about property is that you can have a really good combination of both. It's really sitting down at the very start and saying, what do I need this property to achieve for me? And therefore, is my focus more going to be on growth? Is it more going to be on yield? Is it a mix? And you should always tailor, and you can always tailor that property to your brief. What a lot of investors do is they say, I'm just going to go and buy an investment property. And they might buy somewhere local, or they might buy somewhere that, Uncle Bob has suggested is a great opportunity, or they might buy one of these, off the plan specials where the sales agent is getting a massive kickback, and then wonder why their property isn't performing the way that it should. I think it's really important for investors to understand at the very start that you actually can buy a property which is tailored to your strategy. It shouldn't be the other way around.
To draw a parallel to the stock market, that stocks that produce dividends provide an attractive income to live off, and stocks that grow in value, well, you can sell them, and they each have their distinct tax advantages and disadvantages.
Yeah, so it's understanding that there's a broad spectrum within each investment class, and within property, you can find properties which will have, really amazing capital growth, but they're going to cost you a lot out of pocket every month. So that's not necessarily going to be achievable for everyone. It'll also impact your ability to grow that portfolio depending on your servicing. And then you can find properties at the other end of the spectrum which have really high yields, but they're not necessarily going to grow in value. So yeah, it's just understanding that you can tailor it to yourself. Another thing that people like about the idea of property is it is that tangible asset. It is something that you can walk through. It's something that you can touch. It is something which is in Australia seen as a very stable long-term asset. And it's also something that you can improve the value to. So you can add value through renovations or doing a little bit of work on it as well. So those are some of the things that I find investors are, excited about with property, especially those which feel like the volatility of the share market and other assets might potentially make them feel uncomfortable.
I've also come across the term that, you can't really become an expert in investing in stocks or gold because you can't really change the outcome. Whereas if you become an expert in property, then you can change the outcome, just like you said, by adding value, renovating, purchasing specific property. Like everyone says, get the worst house in the best street sort of thing.
Yeah, you do have a little bit more input into it. That being said, there's things within any market, but within the property market, there's things you can control, and then there's things that you can't control. So you can't control what is happening in the wider market and market forces and cycles, but then you can control the asset selection. So that is choosing the right property, because you can't necessarily renovate any property and add value. It depends on the demand for that end product, and it depends on you don't want to overcapitalize. So you don't want to be putting $1 in and then not being able to get $1 back when you sell that property, and that does happen sometimes.
Yeah, so needing to be strategic about how you actually manage your property investments.
Correct.
Previously, I'd heard of negative gearing and it all just sounded a bit crazy to me. Like I thought, oh, why would I give away money now for potentially maybe getting a return in the future? And it almost felt like a little bit of gambling, and it almost felt like, oh, I'll never be able to retire on this strategy unless I sell these properties. So when I discovered like the idea of a positively geared property, instantly my ears perked up and I was like, oh, that sounds good. Like this thing actually pays for itself. And then I could potentially put that towards a second investment property. Could you talk a little bit more about how investors might be able to use positive gearing to grow a portfolio, and sort of maybe how that compares to negative gearing?
Yeah. So negative gearing, like you said, it's a it's a tax office acknowledging you're making a cash flow loss and then being able to claim that. So the only reason you want to ever negatively gear or make a loss is if you think or you're confident that property is going to grow in capital value. And you do obviously need to be strategic here, but as a very general rule of thumb, the higher the negative gearing for a property, the stronger the capital growth will be, and it will very much return you more than you are putting towards that property out of pocket. So that's all in theory though. That's if you get that asset selection right. But because you're really leveraged in property, so as an investor, you might be borrowing 80%, your returns are also magnified. That's both up and down. So negative gearing is great if you get it right and if you choose a property that will grow quite strongly in value, because then that gives you a lot more flexibility down the track. It gives you equity, which you can then borrow against and purchase more properties, or you can potentially sell down those assets and then use that money to put towards other things as well. So if you get it right, negative gearing can actually be a great thing. That being said, if you are quite negatively geared, that's also going to impact your serviceability to be able to get more loans as well in the future. Whereas if you're positively geared or you've got positive cash flow, then it's going to be a lot easier to build that portfolio. So it is really just understanding at the very start what your strategy is. Your strategy will be quite dependent on your timing. So how long do you have for this strategy? If you're quite young, you might be okay with being a bit more negatively geared and aggressive if you've got more time. But that being said, it also very much depends on your income and expenses. So if you've got a lot of surplus cash and a lot of surplus cash flow, then you may be able to finance a negatively geared portfolio more. And I will mention at the very end too, is that just because a property is negatively geared now doesn't mean it will be forever. And I have two properties in my portfolio which have recently, bought them about 5 years ago, and they were negatively geared. They've just tipped over to positively geared because their rent has increased a bit. Yeah, the rent's gone up, and also interest rates have gone down too. So that, a property doesn't necessarily have to be negatively geared for the long term.
For someone who's maybe starting out on their journey to financial independence and, might have 10 or more years ahead of them earning, a negatively geared strategy could be one that they take. And as they do that, they're basically getting a bit of a tax deduction along the way, and their property is rising in price. And then when they reach financial independence, or say, 10 years down the track, those properties may actually have become cash flow positive, or you might be able to then use that equity that you've built to, as you said, refinance and maybe put that money elsewhere.
And if you do have equity, and also just bearing in mind as well with property investing, it's about the quality of the asset and how it fits in with your strategy, not the quantity. You don't need 10, 20 plus properties to be a successful property investor. You can have 3 or 4 really great assets, which will give you, potentially a similar result in the long term. So I don't necessarily think you just need to think, all right, I need to have a minimum of 5 properties. You need to just sit down, I think, with a strategic advisor, ideally, if this is all over your head, and talk about your goals, your timeframes, your cash flows, and then how property could fit in with that.
Wow. So the overarching theme I'm getting is that it's not a one size fits all answer. And when it comes to property, you really need to have a solid strategy or direction before you buy the first property.
Absolutely. Property as an asset, there's a lot of transaction costs. So you've got your stamp duty, you've got other associated purchase costs, you've got a lot of selling costs as well. And it's a very illiquid asset. So you can't just turn around tomorrow and say, I need that cash, I want to sell it. So for all of these reasons, you want to be investing for the long term. And also, you don't want to be buying the wrong property and then having to sell it because you've made a mistake, because you might actually end up finding that you've gone backwards.
What do you think are some of the risks of property investing?
There's many, many risks, but I suppose there's a very broad risk. It's not getting the strategy right at the start and buying a property that either doesn't perform for you in the right way. So if it's supposed to be a capital growth property and you're negatively geared and it doesn't grow, you haven't achieved that outcome. Or if it needs to be returning you a certain amount and you haven't done your cash flows correctly, or you've got a lot of vacancy because you haven't looked into the rental demographics of that area, then that's not going to achieve your goals as well. So you can buy the wrong property and then it doesn't serve you correctly, and then you may need to sell it. And then if you don't sell it at the right time, then you might not necessarily make a loss, but you also always with investing need to factor in your opportunity cost. So say you sell it in a few years because you can't hold on to it and you've broken even, well, you've missed out on a couple of years of potentially investing that money elsewhere.
Yeah.
You've also got risks in terms of your tenant. A lot of people say, what if I get a terrible tenant? I'm confident that you can very much reduce those risks if you do your correct research into the area. Make sure you get your rental appraisals correct. Always get independent rental appraisals, not just from the selling agent, and then having a really great property manager. And then always getting professional advice. And that is at least with a mortgage broker, strategic mortgage broker at the very beginning, potentially a financial planner if this is something that you feel like you want to build a portfolio over time. And then also making sure that you have quite a big buffer account in case things happen. And we can only look at COVID this year, and that's totally unpredictable. But we've got landlords here in Melbourne that during lockdown they couldn't get a tenant for 6 to 8 weeks. And if you didn't have an emergency buffer to deal with that, then you might have been in a position where you could potentially need to sell. So we just want to make sure that we understand the risks, but you can reduce a lot of risks in property investment as well.
Wow, so it's all about thinking ahead, being strategic, and doing your research.
Yes, with everything, but particularly with property investing.
Wow. So, I guess I champion an index investing approach when it comes to the stock market. And honestly, it's the complete opposite. You literally just buy a parcel of index funds through an ETF or an LIC, and you're done. And you don't really have to do any research. So I guess what this means is that as a property investor, you need to understand that it sounds like it's going to be very much an active investment. It's going to take a lot of time and ongoing effort as opposed to something that's just going to...
If you don't think that you can put that time and energy and research in at the very beginning because you feel like it is, you just don't have enough experience or enough desire to want to teach yourself all of these things, you need to get advice. You can't just rush, go out there and buy a property and think it'll all be fine. It might be fine, but if it's not, then there's a lot of costs involved. And also, being aware that the property industry, like we talked about before, it is unregulated. There are a lot of people out there who are spruiking these, and I use air quotation marks here, like investment opportunities that if you haven't done your research prior, you can get sucked into, and they're selling these crappy off the plan properties or house and land packages where there's no capital growth prospects. And that's where a lot of investors go wrong. Actually, they don't put the energy in at the start, and then they wonder why they didn't get a result.
Feel like I probably should have somehow spoken to you maybe last year before I started getting involved with my property. um, but I think the more I actually talk to you, the more I feel like I am personally going to be someone who's going to benefit from a buyer's agent. Not that I'm not willing to put in the effort, but I feel like I have a lot to learn, and I feel like this is probably something that I need to look at going forward.
Yeah, and on the flip side, what you are talking about in terms of the share market and these other investments, I don't have very much knowledge in that side of things too. So if I was ever investing there, I would either be absolutely educating myself or outsourcing it. I feel like when we're talking about so much money here and so much, we're talking about, setting ourselves up for the future. I think that expert advice, if you aren't able to do the research yourself, is invaluable.
If I was to go out and find a buyer's agent, I guess first of all, how do I find one? What should I be doing to select one? And what are the kind of questions I should be asking them?
So if we're talking specifically around property investment, and I think maybe we'll just focus on that because that is kind of the theme of today. When you're sitting down with a buyer's agent at the very beginning, they should really be uncovering a lot of information about you and your personal situation, and then be able to provide you advice around what property and location could fit within that, not the other way around. If you sit down with someone and they don't take into consideration your personal circumstances, and they're just saying, well, here we go, we've already got a property for you, we've already got something in mind, then understand that they may be getting paid, by a developer, or by, buy an off the plan spruiker to sell you that particular product. So it needs to be tailored to you. So for example, when I'm sitting down with an investor at the very start, I need to have an understanding of what their timelines are, what their goals are for this particular property, if they're planning on purchasing multiple properties, because we'll need to factor that in. But very importantly is their cash flows. So I don't need to know their income or expenses or, real personal details, but I do need to have an understanding of their surplus cash flows that they are willing to contribute towards their portfolio or this particular property. Because then what I do for a client is I give them a cash flow spreadsheet for that particular property we're considering purchasing and say, this is how much, once all of the rent comes in and all of the expenses go out, this is how much this property is going to cost us. And then we'll play around with those numbers until we get the right metrics to suit that investor's cash flows. So that's the process that I go along. And that's what ideally a buyer's advocate who is going to be helping you buy an investment property will do for you as well when you're sitting down with them in that first strategy session.
When someone is looking for an investment property, like how do you know what percentage of that to use? Like, do you want to use it all? Do you want to use half of it? Are there any rules of thumb when selecting property to make sure that you're kind of not overstretching yourself?
There's no rules of thumb because within that sort of surplus bucket, you also need to be having savings. So you don't want to be spending all of your surplus in just putting towards an investment. And then with that surplus, ideally, we're putting more money, we're putting a portion of that money into a buffer as well. And then what we're left with, we need to decide, and this will generally come from the investor themselves, potentially with some financial planning advice, is, well, how am I going to diversify myself within that asset pool too? And diversification could be between different asset classes, or it could be within one asset class and different types of properties, for example. So that is really going to be dependent on that individual investor and also their risk tolerance, what they feel comfortable with. There's so many layers here. If I look at, my portfolio, we have shares and property, but very much heavily weighted towards property. That's because that's what I do. I'm an expert in it. My husband works in property as well, and we are confident that that is the best use of our money. But that is us. That is us based on our personal situation and our experience and our knowledge.
I remember trying to compare the asset classes, I guess stocks and property, for ages and ages. And I don't know if I'm right or not, but I came to the conclusion for me personally that if I was just going to invest like conventionally, like I had a dollar, like I wasn't talking about leverage, that I could get potentially a higher return in the share market with an index fund. But when I factored in the like leverage and the fact that I could borrow, it
Yes.
looked like the cash on cash returns on a property investment were far significant than what you would get in the share market.
This is the power of property, which is that leverage. But like I said earlier, that can go both ways. You have compounding positive returns, but if that asset drops in value, you have compounding negative returns as well. So leverage is very powerful, but you have to use it right. You have to use it correctly.
Talking about risk, like I've seen the articles, the property investor of the year who geared themselves and bought all the mining town properties and was winning awards one year, and then the next year they're obviously bankrupt. So how do you begin to quantify risk? We sort of talked about negative gearing and positive gearing. Is there would a positively geared house be lower risk than a negative geared, or how do you even begin to quantify risk?
Well, it just depends on what type of risk you're talking about. If we're talking about cash flow risk, and that investor really relies on that cash flow because they don't have a certain amount of surplus income to put towards that property, then you need to make sure you're buying in an area which has really low vacancy, really strong tenant demand. You're buying a type of property that has broad appeal to a tenant. So you can define what type of risk that investor is susceptible to and then try and minimize it. You look at these mining towns, and yes, they were really exciting and a lot of people made some money, but those are the people who timed it correctly. They got in at the bottom and out at the top. The people who got in at the top or even halfway up and then it came crashing down, those are horror stories. Those are awful. And now they're stuck with assets that are worth way less than their loans. And in the areas where all of those workers have now left, the yields have plummeted as well. So with property, if something sounds too good to be true, it generally is. You've got to have patience with property.
So, Amy, can you talk a little bit more about how you went around defining your own property strategy and how you went about finding the properties?
Yeah, so I was in a really fortunate position already being in the property industry before I bought my first property. So I was very lucky to get free advice from the professionals around me. And when I started my investing journey, I wasn't married yet. I didn't have a dual income. I was doing it all by myself. So my strategy was more at the very beginning around probably fair to say medium growth, medium yield properties so that I could easily sustain them, but they were still in a metro Melbourne, and there were still properties that had good capital growth potential. And then later on, once my income grew more, once we had a double income in our relationship, then we focused more on much more capital growth properties, which have higher out of pockets, but that's something that we've factored into our long-term strategy. And because I was in the industry as well, very fortunate with my first two properties, bought them off market and bought them for arguably under market value. And then our other two we bought at auction. So and it's interesting, whenever I created a strategy for myself before each purchase, I then bought the first one that I saw because the right one came up at the right time, whereas that's very uncommon for clients. Usually we have to go through quite a bit of a process. That being said, I have seen thousands of properties. So when a good one comes up, I know it's a good one. So yeah, timing it right is important as well. When I'm working with clients, sometimes the right property will come up in the first week, and I'll say to the client why it is one which ticks all of their boxes and it is a green light. But if they're not comfortable already mentally to commit to that, then we keep on that journey because sometimes they need to get that exposure, even though they do know that I have seen thousands of properties before that. everyone's different. Everyone has a different risk profile, and sometimes
Yeah.
they just need that familiarity and exposure to the market before they can make a decision.
So, what's your overall goal with property? Are you going to continue to add um, negatively geared properties to your portfolio? You did mention that some of them have been becoming cash flow positive as the rents increase and with the interest rates going down. So, are you planning to live off the rental income, or what's your strategy?
It's a mixture of both. So it's a mixture of potentially holding on to some quality assets and letting them grow over time, and then having that flexibility with the equity to do what we need to do in the future. But then also having a couple in the mix which are positively geared, and therefore that money is contributing towards our other loans. So we've got our home that we live in as well, and any surplus funds go into that offset account because that is obviously not a tax deductible debt. So it is going to be very much a blended strategy going forward. We did plan on buying another property at the start of this year, and we're ready to go. We had the borrowing capacity, and then COVID happened, and the banks have changed a lot of their lending assessment. So our borrowing capacity dropped quite a bit. So that's on pause, especially because I have my own business as well, and my husband has his own business. It just adds an extra layer of complexity with lending. So it is really about, for us, when we get to the point of having a certain borrowing capacity, then being in a position to make a decision on what we want to do. I reckon with our portfolio that it probably won't be overall cash flow positive, at least for a very, very long time, because it is quite a it's quite a negatively geared portfolio. And it is really more of the growth that we're focusing on. But then in the future, that growth just gives us that flexibility. If we wanted to sell one asset and use that to bring our leverage down on some of the other properties, then that cash flow will be higher. So it is very much a blended strategy.
Interesting. So, how would someone go about extracting that equity? Is you simply need to refinance with the bank?
So you can borrow against that equity to then contribute towards another investment loan, but you need to have the borrowing capacity to do that. Just because you've got equity doesn't necessarily mean you can leverage against it. You still have to have that income and serviceability to demonstrate to the bank that you can afford that loan. So equity is great, but you can't always use it. In some instances, you may choose to liquidate that asset and have the cash.
That's a really good point, Amy. Hey, that if you just because you've got equity doesn't mean you can refinance and get it out. This is probably a segue into a bit of a minefield. We did sort of chat briefly about this before we recorded, and like you said, it's probably best not to go too deeply into it because it's a very tricky situation, and that is property and superannuation. So I've I've seen not so much lately, but certainly a couple of years ago, I was seeing so many ads for buy this property through your self-managed super fund.
Yes.
Have you had any experience with that, or what would your warnings be?
So SMSF, so self-managed super fund, it's very heavily regulated space, and so it should be. It's a financial product, and as an advocate, I have worked with clients buying within their super fund before, but they need to seek the advice of a financial planner who puts that strategy together for them, and then they come to me and say, all right, this is my budget and this is the yield that property needs to achieve, and then I go and implement that for them. And with property in super, there's also a couple of rules around that too. For example, everything has to be on one title. So if you buy an apartment and the car park's on an accessory title, that might be an issue. Plus, you're not allowed to live in it at any point. Your kids aren't allowed to live in it. So you need to adhere to all these extra rules. So it is quite complex. You absolutely need to get financial advice to set it up. There's also a lot of costs involved. It is a lot harder to borrow to buy property in your super funds these days. So yeah, a lot of extra stuff you need to be aware of there.
Okay, well, it sounds like a lot of red flags. Maybe not as
Well, with
easy as
these
the spruikers.
companies, with these companies, like you said before, you need to understand, well, are they tailoring this property to my investment strategy, or are they just trying to sell, this crappy product off the plan? Because people get really excited about the idea of potentially buying property in super, but it is, yeah, it's a minefield, and there is a lot of the property industry is full of big commissions and therefore a lot of unscrupulous advice, unfortunately.
I've previously described it as, there's too many hands in the cookie jar. So
Well, there's a
people,
lot of dirty hands. This is the problem. There's a lot of people who haven't washed their hands beforehand.
oh, this is very,
It's
very
not
appropriate for COVID.
exactly. It's just, you know, these people don't need any qualifications to be doing what they're doing. The government, I think, really needs to sit down and look at this. This is a massive issue. And there are horror stories of, people approaching retirement and they've been sold this product which they think is going to help them achieve a better outcome in retirement, and it does the opposite. So yeah, it's horrifying.
This has actually been very educational for me. So thank you very
Oh, I'm
much for,
glad.
taking the time. Basically, what I'm sort of coming to the conclusion is that, property is a very complicated asset class. It's not something you want to cheap out on. You really need to do your research. And that means getting professionals that know their shit, whether that's a financial planner or advisor, a mortgage broker, and a buyer's agent would seem to be the minimum of three people that you'd need, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that being said, not all financial planners love property. So if you want to invest in property, that's what you've chosen to do. Finding a financial property, finding a financial planner that has an understanding and appreciation of property. I mean, with a buyer's advocate, I always recommend an investor gets it. But even if you're looking to buy a home, your home isn't technically an investment. Though, if you can make the right decision on buying an investment grade home, then, hopefully that property grows in value over time as well. And that will just give you a little bit of an advantage in the future.
Well, that's right. And your home is free from capital gains tax as well. Is that right?
It is. It is. We don't want to consider it as a specific asset because it's not something that you can just sell. It is something that the purpose of that is providing security for you, for housing security. But yes, it is CGT free. So in the future, if you wanted to downsize, then having more equity is better because it'll just give you more options to then, use whatever you want to use that cash for.
What's your opinion on super? So do you like super? Do you invest more, and is that a part of your overall financial strategy?
So I don't contribute any more to my super. So I don't sacrifice any extra. Super for me, I see as a bonus. I'm in my early 30s still, so I have a little bit of time, and my strategy is to achieve financial independence well below retirement, well below the official retirement age. So I see super as a bonus for me. That being said, if I was closer to retirement, then obviously the tax advantages of using your super fund correctly are really great. Also, side note here, for any first home buyers, I would definitely advise looking into the first home super saver scheme. It is a bit complicated to get your head around. I did an episode on it in my podcast, but that is a great way of using your super fund to turbocharge your savings for a first home.
I'm not going to try and say it because I can't even pronounce it. The first
FHSS.
FHS. Okay, it's not as bad as I thought then. What advice could you give to someone who's looking to basically do something similar and start up their own business, follow their passion?
What I've learned the most through doing my own business, but also just being in the property industry, is networking. And this is just, this is how you and I met. I mean, that's kind of a form of networking. It's connecting with each other and, realizing we have something in common and then forming relationships out of that. So whether that be doing it in person, going to networking events, making connections on LinkedIn or Instagram or whatever you want to do, that's where I have found the most opportunities. And I have reached out to people this year, in people that I really admire in the finance and property industry, and asked them to connect, and they've all said yes. But the worst they could have said is no. So just mustering up the courage to reach out and talk to people, and also then working and fostering those existing relationships you've got, because your previous clients and professionals you've worked with are your best referrers and always your warmest referrers too. So they're the ones who are going to say, Amy's great. She does an amazing job. I've used her. I've got clients who have used her, that you have to speak to her. So people, it's all about the people, putting yourself out there. Actually, that's another thing too. Don't be afraid to put your face out there. So my business is me. My business is, if you come to use me as an advocate, you get me and only me. Therefore, it's called Amy Lunardi Property. And therefore, I've, mustered up the courage to put my face on the website and on Instagram, and just having that connection with people, I think, is really important.
So, Amy, what would be your 3 favorite personal finance, investing, or self-development books?
All right, I'm going to go the self-development ones here. One I finished recently was Atomic Habits, which I'm sure everyone has heard about. And that was great because it talks about how little tiny changes here and there can snowball into bigger results. I also really love that book by David Goggins. Do you know him? The fittest guy in the world.
Is that Can't Hurt Me?
Can't Hurt Me. Yep. So I love that book. I think he takes things very much to the extreme, but to me, it really kind of made me like, suck it up a bit. When I found that things were getting hard or things were getting difficult, I'm like, nah, David Goggins, like, just get through it and toughen up. And I also finished a book just recently, which is called Why We Sleep. And I thought that was amazing because, it's something that, especially in this era where, like the hustle, everyone's talking about hustle and grinding and, working really hard and, forgetting that things like downtime and things like sleep are important. So that book was really amazing to reinforce that more self-care side of things. In this book, it said, the equivalent to not having the correct amount of sleep. And this is 8 hours. It's not 7 or 6 hours. It's 8 hours of sleep, over even a week is like having a full night without sleep, or it's like being under the influence of alcohol. So yeah, it's really compelling.
Well, in aviation, we talk about sleep deprivation, and I think it's 17 hours awake, which, by the way, that's very common for airline pilots to be awake for 17 hours.
Wow.
You are given an opportunity to rest because you have multiple crew members, but it's not the same restful sleep you would get on the ground. But 17 hours awake, I think that's equivalent to a 0.05, like the legal driving limit. So
yeah. How scary is that?
Yeah, and so if you have delays and things that mean that all of a sudden your pilot's now awake for 20 hours, legally their impairment is the same as someone who's not able to drive a car. So that's a really great. I'm really glad you brought that up. So I haven't actually read Why We Sleep, and that's going on my reading list.
On your list.
Thanks. What would be your top piece of advice for someone who's on the path to financial independence?
So firstly, it's about patience. It's about understanding that investing, whether it's in property or anything, is for the long term. And sometimes it feels like you might not be achieving anything, but you just have to be patient. It's about cash flows, so understanding everything that comes in, everything goes out, and then what you do with that surplus. It's about using debt correctly. So not going out and buying depreciating debt, buying, if you're going to use leverage, buying something like an investment property, which will appreciate hopefully in time. And it's about those risk mitigation methods. So doing a lot of research at the start, having your emergency buffers, having the right insurances, absolutely, when you buy any property. And by doing all of that, it will mean that hopefully you don't have to sell your assets at the wrong time. So being able to hold on to them, and again, being patient for the long term. And then also just working to your risk profile as well. So there's no point in being really aggressive with your investing in your portfolio if you're just going to lose sleep over it and lose sleep over the natural, fluctuations in the market. So if you're really conservative by nature, then just understanding that you might want to tailor your portfolio towards that.
Amy, I've had a great time chatting to you this afternoon. Just looking back, is there anything we haven't covered today that you'd like to bring up?
So my whole, I suppose, passion is around property education. And I totally acknowledge and understand that not everyone can afford to use a buyer's agent, especially first home buyers. So I've got my podcast, which is called The Buyer's Bible. That's specifically for first home buyers. I've also got a free first home buyer course coming out soon with, the team at the Australian Finance Podcast.
Yes.
So you can keep an eye out for that. And then I've got a new educational product launching later this year. So this is just being able to get all of this information out to people who really need it and people who may not be able to afford or want to use a buyer's agent.
Fantastic. Well, I'm definitely going to be getting into those, and I'm sure everyone's going to be pretty keen for it to come out. If people want to get in touch with you, you mentioned you have, of course, the podcast. You're on social media. Whereabouts can people find you?
Best to go just straight to my website. Everything's on there, including the Instagram and the contact details, which is just amylunardi.com.au.
Oh, all wrapped up in one neat little
Easy
package.
There you go.
Fantastic, awesome. Hey, well, it's been great. It's been a educational experience for me, and expect potentially an email from someone looking for their second property.
Thanks for having me, Captain.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Captain Fi Financial Independence Podcast. To read the transcripts or check out the show notes, head over to www.captainfi.com for all the details. If you have a question for the captain, make sure to get in touch. You might even make it on the airwaves. You can reach me online through the Captain Fi contact form or get in touch through the socials. I'm active on Facebook and Instagram, as well as a number of online finance and investing forums. And finally, remember, the information presented on the show and the links provided are for general information purposes only. They should not be taken as constituting professional financial advice. You should always do your own research when making any financial decisions and make sure it's appropriate for your personal circumstance.